All right, well, before I get started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce my co-presenter, who is my son, Hugo, who's on the floor behind me. You can probably hear him. He's excited now. He's smiling because he knows I'm talking about him.
Right.
So he's here today with me because he's at home from daycare. So you might hear him chattering in the background, reminding me of all the things I'm supposed to be saying. So I'm really excited to be here and talking with all of you, and hopefully get to meet with you and talk to you later after the talk. So I'm really glad to hear there's time for that. So, hey, buddy. So today I'm talking about developing global experiences for all engineering students. And I thought I would start by kind of introducing myself, since I don't think I know very many people on the call. So you read a lot of this information already, but just a little background is that I was an engineer for a while. Actually, I studied engineering and then I went and worked as an engineer. And a lot of my research interest stems from my time working as an engineer and realizing what kinds of skills and abilities engineers actually need in the workplace. And one of those things that I ran into when I was working was intercultural learning and the ability to work with people who come from different backgrounds and different places. And so I had studied abroad as an undergraduate student in engineering, but I was one of the only people I knew in engineering who did. And I felt like that really helped me when I was working as an engineer. And so when I went back to grad school, I kind of focused in on this question of why don't more engineering students do this? Because it seems like it would be really helpful. And so while I was at Virginia Tech, I got really involved with I helped to run a study abroad program for first year engineering students. And so these are some pictures of different programs that I went on through that program, and I helped to coordinate that. And then now that I'm here as an assistant professor, my research has kind of continued to focus in this area. And so just a quick overview of the research that my research group works on. He's super excited about this talk. So our research group works on kind of what I just said, preparing students for success in identifying and solving engineering problems in real work environments. And so this was kind of one of the things I felt like when I got to industry as an engineer. I had all this theoretical knowledge, but I didn't have any like good examples of what does engineering work like, and how does it work to actually implement a project in a real work environment. And so I focus on what types of problems do engineers have to solve? How do they actually work across differences, whether that's kind of cultural differences, like I'll talk about today, or different disciplines. And then also working within complex systems, which I think also relates to kind of the intercultural piece as well. And so today I'll kind of focus on, these are the kind of the different sections of my research. One is global engineering programs, which I'm going to talk about today. And then I also look at systems thinking, how do we teach and assess that skill? And then experiential learning opportunities kind of more broadly. So I do look at undergraduate research and service learning and things like that as well. All right. All right, so for today, what I'm focusing on kind of within the global learning piece of my research is thinking about how do we design effective non-travel global experiences. And this is kind of a shift in my research. I was focusing in my PhD a lot more on study abroad, things that involve travel. But then COVID-19 kind of shifted my research because suddenly I couldn't study that anymore. Nobody was studying abroad and travel was really difficult. But I find that this is actually really good for thinking about engineering students, because studying abroad can be really challenging for engineering students with the way that engineering curriculum is structured, and kind of the culture of engineering doesn't encourage students to do it a lot of the time. And so thinking about non-travel experiences can really help with trying to make this sorts of learning more accessible to more students. So what I'm going to cover today, kind of briefly for each piece, and then hopefully leave lots of things open for questions, is why is it important to offer non-travel global experiences? What are creative approaches to non-travel global learning? How can we support students in these kinds of experiences? And then how can we learn from students who actually do go abroad, the experiences that are meaningful for them, and how could that inform the design of experiences at home? So firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about why not study abroad, particularly for engineering students. How can this be a challenge? So there's some things that I think can be a challenge for any student. So financial challenges, I think a lot of people are familiar with that. Personal responsibilities is increasingly, I think, common as more and more non-traditional students. So people who have, childcare responsibilities like myself, it can be really hard to travel at that point in time, or you need to work, or you have other family responsibilities. So anything like that can make study abroad challenging. And then lastly, and particularly for engineering students, curriculum complexity can really make it hard. And this includes both kind of engineering programs are often very structured, where you have to take a sequence of courses in a certain order. You have to have all the prerequisites. And if you miss a semester, suddenly you're thrown off from the whole thing. And, you have to stay an extra semester to graduate. So that's part of it. And then there's also just the challenge of transferring engineering courses between universities. Engineering departments are often very protective of their courses. There's kind of a culture, disciplinary culture there that can make it hard for students to study abroad. And on top of that, engineering is especially challenging because engineering students often begin college with a lower intent to study abroad than many other majors. There's actually research into motivation and who wants to study abroad, and engineering students are usually at the bottom of the list. And part of that is because they don't necessarily see that this is a thing that is related to engineering. It doesn't seem on the surface like engineering is going to need intercultural skills. And so engineering students in another study were 60% less likely to expect to study abroad than humanities majors, for example. So they just didn't see the connections. They didn't understand that engineering might actually benefit from this. And so I actually have done interviews as part of one of my earlier projects with engineering students who did study abroad. And a lot of what came out of it was the logistical challenges that they faced in making it happen. And so I have some quotes from those interviews, just of the way that students would talk about their experience trying to make study abroad happen for them. So this was one student who went on for a really long part of the interview talking about how hard it was to transfer credits back into his engineering program. And he finally decided, I can't even transfer any of my regular classes. It has to be electives. That's the secret to getting as many classes as you can, because most of those won't even transfer. So you need to submit tons and tons of syllabi, and eventually you'll get the 5 classes that will be able to transfer. And so this was a common story that I heard across interviews. Students often having a really hard time figuring out what they can even transfer that's going to count towards their program. Another thing that people would have trouble with is even getting support within the College of Engineering or within their engineering department to figure out how can I study abroad? What are the logistics of this? And so this was a student who had trouble when she went into her academic advisor's office, and she essentially said, you don't have a chance, there's no way. This is not a success, right, for engineering students who want to study abroad, especially because we're increasingly aware that study abroad is really helpful and important for engineering students. All right, let me go pick him up in a second here. But so my conclusion here is just that engineering students often face low motivation to study abroad, right? That's what the research has shown, but they also have really high barriers to entry. And so my question is, what can we do to provide all engineering students with global learning given this context? And it's really challenging. So hold on a second, I'm going to go pick up my co-presenter. So I think he'd rather look at the screen with me. Okay. Let's go over here. All right. You want to say hi? Oh. All right.
Oh.
You go. All right, buddy, you can help me. All right, we're going to talk about 3 projects so that the different grad students that are working with me are working on. So the first one is focusing on COVID impacts on international research experiences. And the second one focuses on experiences in global virtual teams, which has been a really popular way to kind of incorporate global learning in engineering. And then lastly, I'll talk about a project that I'm just starting where I'm trying to use video reflections to understand student learning abroad, and kind of how I hope that project will help me find new ways of incorporating global learning into classrooms. All right, so project 1, thinking about creative approaches to non-travel global learning. So this project is an NSF-funded project where we have a grant to look at international research experience for students programs, which is IRES, and Partnerships for International Research and Education, which is PIRE. So these are 2 grant programs that the NSF funds, where faculty members can get funding to send students to do research abroad. So this can be undergrad or grad students. It can take, usually what it looks like is 6 to 10 weeks in the summer. Students go to a lab in another country and do research. And these programs are a really good way for engineering students to get global experiences because they are in the summer, so it doesn't necessarily influence the curriculum kind of piece of it. And these experiences are paid, so they look a lot like an engineering internship. So they kind of have more, I don't know, your engineering faculty are more likely to look at this and say, okay, this is a good engineering experience in addition to being a good international experience. So students get a lot more support for these types of programs. And so a lot of engineering students will choose to do this instead of doing an internship in the summer. And so what we did was we had studied, myself and my colleagues at Virginia Tech had studied some of these programs before COVID. And then we got this new grant to look at, well, what happens when you have to shift this stuff to being virtual? Like, what are ways that we can, what are the benefits of being virtual? What are the challenges of being virtual? What kind of structures for these programs can we design that makes virtual possible? And how might this improve the programs in the future? And so we did 8 focus groups with people who have these grants and asked them, what did you do during COVID? What kind of creative approaches did you have that allowed you to continue running your program despite the fact that we weren't able to travel? So what we found was a lot of different creative strategies that people employed. People were really, really creative in trying to figure out how can we keep the global piece in our program without having to travel. So one of the big things was a lot of people talked about using local resources. So people talked about playing movies for their students, taking them to local concerts or restaurants, cooking meals with colleagues abroad. So they would get on Zoom and, normally these students would be hanging out with the people in the other country, cooking the meals or doing something, kind of in their local context there. But so instead we just did it on Zoom and everybody got to do it together and kind of share that experience, even if it was remote. Doing things like visiting local cultural festivals or groups that were holding events or things like that were all things that PIs talked about using as ways to integrate culture into their kind of research experience without having to travel. The other thing that was really interesting that we didn't think about kind of when we were putting this together was that PIs were really creative about connecting with people abroad. So this means that like when they would normally send students abroad, they would mostly just work with the collaborating researchers. But when they were remote, they suddenly started thinking, well, are there other people that we could connect our students to using Zoom? Because it's a little bit easier to use Zoom to have a meeting with, let's say, like a leader in the local community where they were supposed to be visiting, or other students in that space. Or I had somebody who they were able to connect with people at nonprofits in the area that were doing things related to the topic of the research. And so they were able to use the virtual environment to connect in different ways with different people who might not have been able to make time with for them, if they tried to show up in their office in person. But doing a quick 20-minute Zoom meeting was much more feasible. So that was really, really interesting. The other thing that we found was really creative that a lot of people started doing was more hybrid types of programs. So instead of assuming we have to send the students abroad for, the whole 6 to 10 weeks, which, if you're somebody who has a restricted schedule, you can't do that. But maybe they could go abroad for 1 week and then they could spend the rest of the program remotely. But having that initial week abroad would allow them to start to make the connections with people, build the relationships that they can then continue remotely after that. And that just improved the accessibility of the program for more types of students than were previously able to participate. So just a couple quotes to talk through some of the creative strategies. This was the example of the cooking. So this person talked about how they did online cooking with their colleagues in Australia. Everything was they're making the things in their own kitchens and then sharing it on Zoom. They watched Australian rules football games together, and they had the students plan a little party on Zoom to share with the Australians. So these are things that are challenging with time zones that came up a lot as well. But in order to try to build connection with people as you're trying to collaborate around the world, it can be really helpful to build in these types of experiences. Another person talked about how this was the person who was trying to do the hybrid programs that were really creative. And so they were looking for people who normally weren't able to participate in programs. And so by having the short-term experience, where they could go for just 1 week instead of going for the whole summer, then maybe the next year once they got a little more comfortable with the idea of traveling, maybe their parents got more comfortable with the idea of them traveling. And that created the opportunity for these students who maybe would never even have thought of applying for a program like this. And so this was somebody who was at a minority serving institution as well. And so they found that the people that they were really hoping to participate were more able to participate when they built in these hybrid program options. All right, let's talk about project 2. So in this one, I looked at students in the virtual global teams. So in this case, there's a engineering design project course where students work in teams on different projects. And these students are from multiple years, multiple different majors. It's a pretty interdisciplinary class. And it's also, in the past, during COVID, they kind of started integrating people from Ecuador and Mexico from different universities to be part of the project team. So it became this collaborative, each team had people from each of the different universities. And so what we did to learn more about student experiences in these teams is we collected some quantitative data using the Intercultural Development Inventory. And we also did qualitative data where we looked at student reflections, and we had them write a 1 to 2 page reflection at the start, at the middle, and at the end of the semester. And so the topics of these reflections were what were their goals for the project, what kind of learning were they interested in, and as they got further in the semester, what were areas where they felt that maybe their team could improve or they could improve in working with their team successfully. And so what we're really interested in was how did student experiences change from the start of the semester to the end of the semester, and what challenges did students face as they were working in these teams? So I think maybe the not surprising finding for many of you who are interested in intercultural learning is that if you just drop students into global teams, they're not immediately going to learn intercultural skills, right? You have to support them in doing that, similar to study abroad, right? And so what we found was that students who had prior intercultural training, so if they had taken like a prior course through the GEAR program here, or something like that, then they saw an increase in their IDI scores. But the other students who maybe this is their first global experience in this class didn't see changes in their scores as a result of taking in the pre-post comparison. The other thing we noticed when we looked at the reflections was that students focused on intercultural learning at the start of the semester. They're really excited going into the project. Oh yeah, it's going to be wonderful. I'm going to develop my intercultural skills. I'm really excited about working on a global team. But then the further we got in the semester with the mid-semester reflections and the end of semester reflections, they got more and more interested in professional and technical skills. And so the less and less focus on the cultural learning piece. And then the last thing, we were thinking about challenges. There were students identified a lot of ways to approach the team challenges that they faced, but they were hesitant or rarely able to acknowledge failure. So even though they might say, oh, our team has experienced this challenge, they would then say, but we've resolved it, we fixed it, it's all taken care of, we've learned and we're moving on. And so it's kind of this, it was interesting that failure and challenges were something that they had a hard time discussing. So those were our key findings from the student reflections. And here's just some quotes to kind of show how the topics of the reflections shifted kind of from the start to the end of the semester. So at the start, they would be focusing a lot on, I'd like to learn about, how to resolve conflict, how to work through cultural barriers, things like I hope that by working closely with students of a different background than me, that we can learn from each other. And perhaps we can think about problems we will face in different ways and we'll come together to form a great solution. So they were very interested and excited to work on these global teams. But then by the end of the semester, a lot of the reflections focused on kind of the more engineering or professional development side of the project. So this person's talking about the Reynolds number. So it was some calculations they needed to do for the project. Other people talking about how they needed to assign responsibilities, time management, those sorts of things. And so the topics shifted a lot in the reflections over the course of the semester. All right, so project 3, we're looking at how can we use what we know from students who do study abroad to design effective non-travel experiences. So yeah, that's kind of what I just said. I want to get an in-depth understanding of what students experience abroad so that we can figure out how to translate pieces of that into classroom-based or at-home-based activities. And so what I did here was I'm looking at trying to use a different type of data collection technique, basically videos that students make while they're studying abroad on a week-to-week basis. So this is a lot of research on study abroad has used things like in-program journals sometimes. That's kind of if you want something that's more real-time to while students are abroad, they often use journals. Or a lot of research will do post-program interviews or maybe pre and post-program interviews. And these types of data collection methods, give you different kinds of data. And so I wanted to explore if I do something completely different with videos, will I get, a different kind of data? And so this study focuses on exploring kind of the information power that's available in different methods. So we looked at things like sample size and how rich and in-depth the data was. And we wanted to know, how does the information power different across these methods of data collection so that we can figure out what's going to help us understand student experiences abroad. And so our findings here so far, and this one we're kind of early in the study and we've just done a pilot with 10 students so far. But so far what it looks like is that the video reflections provide really interesting longitudinal data compared to the other types. In addition, they also have really rich reflection, the students talk more than they write, right, compared to journals. So we have asked students to write a journal, they'll write a paragraph, but you ask them to tell you a story and they'll talk for 10 minutes. And you get a lot more detail. And so that it's really, really interesting looking at, you ask students, we asked in these different comparisons, we asked them the same questions, and they responded in very different levels of depth. And in the way that they talked about experiences was very different. And so these are some of the benefits of using the videos. And so I'm continuing to work on this project and try to explore how can I learn more about kind of the day-to-day experience of studying abroad and use that to figure out how can we incorporate some of those types of experiences into engineering classrooms. So this is just one example of a quote, and I'm not going to read it for the sake of time, but it goes into a lot more detail than you might see in a student journal, for example. And so, the person is kind of really reflecting in the moment. They're talking through their thoughts and talking through not only what happened in a particular experience where they went on a tour and realized that it was going to be in German instead of English, but then they talk through what is this, what are the implications for my language learning and what I'm going to do in the future on this experience. And so compared to the other types of data collection, there's a lot of detail about a particular incident, how this incident might influence future experiences, and a view into kind of a particular moment within a larger experience abroad. All right, so kind of to wrap up and connect these different pieces together, what do I take away from the different projects that we're working on in my group? So the key thing that we're thinking about now is, any format for cultural learning requires intentional design and support. So I think that's probably not surprising to everyone here, but having any sort of intercultural training can really help students get more out of, for example, virtual teams, those types of experiences. Providing mentoring and feedback, that was something that came out a lot when we were talking to the IRES PIs. They were dealing with these students who were virtual and trying to learn cultural experiences. And so really trying to provide lots of hands-on feedback and mentoring can be really helpful in that kind of context. Reflection activities like the videos and like the written reflections that we did in the virtual teams were really helpful for the students to be able to process the different experiences that they were having. And the thing that we took away from the virtual teams that we need to improve for the future is that kind of the reason we think the students shifted more towards thinking about engineering and professional skills at the end was because they were mostly getting graded on their engineering project, and very little of the grade was actually related to the intercultural learning. So trying to figure out how to align more of the grading and more of the project with the intercultural piece, if that's something that we're really hoping they're going to get out of the experience. And then lastly, across all of these different studies, I'm continuing to try to figure out how do you help students connect engineering and culture, because it's the most common thing I see is people who are like, okay, here's the cool culture piece that I learned, and here's the cool engineering piece that I learned, but they don't make the connection of how are they related and why is this important for engineering? How is the engineering influenced by the culture? And so it's something that when preparing programs and experiences for engineering students, it helps to make that really, really explicit and ask students to make the connection, because very few people will actually make the connection on their own. So kind of to summarize, I think that something I'm continuing to be interested in and continuing to work on is figuring out how global experiences at home and virtually have the potential to improve access to cultural learning for engineering students. And like we've probably seen before in study abroad, just providing contact with culture isn't enough, right? Just dropping people into a virtual team isn't going to help them develop intercultural competence without mentoring and support and intentional design of the experience. Yeah, so I just said that part. Cultural training and mentoring is really important. So that's what I have for today. And thanks for enjoying my my co-presenters' contributions as well.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And Absolutely, he added something to, you know, to the experience. So that's great. Hello. Hi.
Hey, buddy.
Hi, what's his name?
Hugo. His name is Hugo.
Oh, that's neat.
Nice to meet you, Hugo. Is that Hugo's first conference presentation?
It is, yeah. Starting early.
Great. That's a first. Very nice. So thank you so much, Kirsten. If you do have any questions, and there is a question in the chat, we can address that a little bit later. And let's hear it now from Aparajita. Aparajita, you can share the screen.
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, it works, Aparajita. Everything is great.
Okay, so hello everyone, I am Aparajita and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Salmar, and I completed my PhD last year from Purdue University. I graduated in 2022, and so how I developed interest in intercultural competence is really a story, because I used to work with Dr. Robert Cox from the Office of Globalization, and he was the Dean of Globalization at that point of time. So I used to work as his TA, and he basically introduced me to the concept of intercultural competence, and I developed my interest in this field, and currently I'm doing my postdoc in this particular domain. So today I'm going to talk about a very important topic, and Kristen has already spoken a lot about how intercultural competence and engineering is important. So we already know that this is really an important thing, but I'm going to talk from the study abroad perspective, and I will be focusing on an intentionally designed study abroad curriculum, that how that helped students to develop intercultural competence. So let's start. So before we dive into the topic, it is very important for us to understand the intersection between engineering and intercultural competence. So if you look at the engineering curriculum, it is very hard-coded. In that case, I would say it is very technical. The focus is on developing technical skills, and it is very systematic. I would say the focus on the soft skills such as teamwork, intercultural competence, that is not there much, because the focus is to solve complex problems. So, but after these students graduate, they are expected to work in diverse team. And consequently, that has led to the need or opportunities for the engineering students to engage and collaborate with people from diverse background. But as I already mentioned, if you look at the engineering curriculum, it is focused on acquisition of the hard skill. And also, if you look at a typical engineering classroom, research has revealed that there is very less representation from people from diverse population. There is also a very lower representation of female students in the engineering classrooms. Research has also revealed that engineering students are ethnocentric, and one of the key reasons is they don't get enough opportunity to collaborate and work with people from diverse backgrounds. After they graduate, they find it challenging to work with diverse population, because the focus was again on the hard skill and not on the soft skill. We thought that, okay, let's look into some of the literatures at the intersection of intercultural competence and engineering. And honestly, there is a lack of evidence or literatures that discuss the impactful interventions conducted in the domain of intercultural learning and engineering. So there are a few action items for us. The first thing, as a researcher, it is our responsibility to design and develop effective interventions at the intersection of intercultural competence and engineering. And second, share those research findings and evidences to the community so that they can use those interventions in order to implement them in their classrooms. The intent of this particular study is to showcase the application of an intentionally designed study abroad program on intercultural competence of engineering students. The research question that we are going to pursue through this study is, what is the impact of intentionally structured study abroad program on the intercultural learning gains of engineering students? So the program that I'm going to talk about today is known as Semester Abroad Intercultural Learning Scholarship Program, or SAIL. So this particular program is a semester-long or a year-long study abroad opportunity for the students. The beauty of this program is it allows students from all the colleges to participate, but for this particular study, we are going to specifically talk about the engineering students. So there are three key components attached to this program. The first is the pre-departure. So having a pre-departure component in a study abroad program is very crucial because it sets the tone or the foundation for that particular program. So in the SAIL program, all the students are provided an overview of the program. They are also told about what are the various methods of engagement while they are studying abroad. Then students' cohorts are created and students take their pre-IDI prior to the departure of their study abroad. Another important component of this structured curriculum is known as GLUE. GLUE stands for Growing, Learning, and Understanding Everyone. So GLUE is a curriculum which is designed by Salmar staff and graduate team. So it is a 1 credit hour course which has 8 units. And the best part about GLUE is that it is very theoretically grounded. There are 3 theories that has gone into the development of GLUE. The first one is known as the IDC, that is Intercultural Development Continuum. Second is the SORAIL's praxis model. And the third is the IKC rubrics, which is given by AACU. So those are the 3 important frameworks that has laid the foundation for the GLUE. Another important thing to note about this curriculum is that this curriculum focuses on the learning outcomes based on the Bloom's taxonomy, but it focuses on a higher order outcome. By higher order, I mean the focus is more on the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation of intercultural learning, and the focus is less on knowledge comprehension and application aspects. The third important component of this particular program is mentoring, and these mentors play a very important role. So all the mentors who serve as in the mentor team for this particular program, they all are qualified IDI administrators. Second, these mentors, they undergo a rigorous training. They also meet the course instructors as well as the course designer before meeting their teams. So since, as I already mentioned, all these mentors are qualified IDI administrators, so they use the pre-IDI scores of the students to provide stage-based feedback throughout the study abroad program. They also provide feedback on their assignments. The most important component of this is like every mentor meets the student cohort for 90 minutes after every 2 units. So effectively, there are 4 such meetings with the cohort and the mentor. And prior to this meeting, mentors, they meet the instructor before this live session. The job of these mentors is to engage students into the reflections and reflections on their experiences. So they basically play a very major role to help them understand what they are going through when they are in a foreign country. So that is a very important role that allowed the students to reflect on their experience and learn from that. So for this particular study, I have grounded this study in the Kolb's learning cycle. According to Kolb, there is no learning without an experience. So you can only learn when you have an experiential component attached to it. So looking at the study abroad program, I would say study abroad itself is an experiential learning activity or an experiential learning initiative. So in order to activate the 4 phases of Kolb's cycle and integrated with the SAIL program, I think the concrete experience, the study abroad itself provides a concrete experience to the students, because for many students, it's a novel experience. And for many students, this is a different experience from their prior study abroad initiatives. The reflection aspect of the Kolb's learning cycle is activated by the mentors, and they play an important role because they engage these students who are basically sophomores or juniors in the reflection activities, and they are very new to reflection. So that is an important role played by the mentors who activate the second phase of the Kolb's learning cycle. The third phase is known as abstract conceptualization. And in this particular phase, once the students, they learn to reflect, it's very important for them to draw on their metacognition, the prior knowledge, and critically think while they are reflecting. So basically the assignments, they serve as a guided reflections for these students that allow them to think on their prior experience in order to understand the current experience. So these assignments, they contain prompts, and these prompts, they serve as, I would say, they scaffold the students in order to think in the correct direction. Finally, the active experimentation. So this program also allows students to interact with people, like local people from that particular country. For example, there is a specific assignment which is known as the interview assignment. And in this particular assignment, students are required to interview someone from a different culture and understand their perspective regarding intercultural competence. So I think there are a lot of opportunity where students can actually implement what they are learning during the program and also apply it in a real world setting. Okay, so we will dive into a method section. So in this, just to remind you of the research question that we are going to talk about is what is the impact of intentionally structured study abroad program on intercultural learning gains of the engineering students? So participants for this study were 74 engineering students who were enrolled in the SAIL 2022 program. Data was collected in two ways. The quantitative data was in the form of the pre and the post IDI, and the qualitative data was in the form of the written reflections. The data analysis, actually the quantitative data was analyzed using multiple techniques such as descriptive statistics, t-test, clustering, and one-way ANOVA, whereas the qualitative data was thematically analyzed using inductive thematic analysis. So before I dive into a results section, because there are a lot of results, so I thought that, okay, I should provide an overview. So I have divided the results section into three phases. In the first phase, I basically talk about the overall comparison of the pre and the post IDI scores for all the 74 students. And I use descriptive statistics and a box plot to showcase that. In the second phase, I basically created clusters using hierarchical clustering algorithm. And I did some ANOVA just to showcase the pre and the difference between the pre and the post test scores of the clusters. And in the third phase, I will showcase the thematic analysis cluster-wise. So let's dive into the results section of the study. So the phase one talks about the results for all the 74 students. You can see that they started in the minimization somewhere at 92.16 points, and there was a gain of 9.49 points, which was actually a meaningful gain as per the IDI. So what do I mean by a meaningful gain? So meaningful gain means like if you showcase a gain of 7 or more points on an IDI, it is considered as meaningful. So these students, they grew from 92.16 to 101.66, demonstrating a meaningful gain on an IDI continuum. The results from the t-test illustrated that there was a significant gain in the DO scores of the post, like in the post-test DO scores. You can see the box plots right there, and it was significant at 99%, like 99% or 99 confidence interval. So now we will dive into the second part of the results, which is the cluster analysis. So what I did, I used a very simple machine learning algorithm, which is known as word hierarchical clustering. And it is an unsupervised machine learning algorithm that basically helps to create clusters from the existing data. So what I did, I took the pre and the post test scores for all the 74 students, and I just put it into my algorithm, which I wrote it using R software. And it helped me to divide the students into three clusters. The first one was cluster 1, second was cluster 2, and third was cluster 3. And you can see the nomenclature for these three clusters. C1 was a high intercultural learning gain cluster because students in this cluster demonstrated I would say a very high gain in the intercultural competence. C2 was a moderate intercultural learning gain cluster, and the C3 was low intercultural learning gain cluster. So we will see details about this cluster in our upcoming slides. So as you can see, C1 consisted of 11 students, and they started at the cusp of minimization and polarization, which was 86.75, and they demonstrated a massive gain of 31.60 points, which was definitely significant. It was meaningful, and their mean, if you see the group mean of this particular group, it is somewhere in acceptance. So they started at the cusp of minimization and polarization, and they reached to acceptance. For the C2 students, we saw that they started in minimization. They definitely had a meaningful gain of 12.23 points, and the post-DO score was significant. For the C3 students, they started at 94.94, which is again in minimization. We saw that there was a decrease of negative 4.84 points. An important thing to note here is, even though this particular decrease is significant, but it is not meaningful. In order to have a meaningful regression on a intercultural development continuum, you have to show a decrease of negative 7 points. So in this case, we see that there was a decrease. It was statistically significant, but not meaningful. So when we talk, if you take a close look at the pre-IDI or the pre-DO scores for these clusters, it's very interesting because we see that cluster 3 students, they had the highest DO score when they started, followed by cluster 2 students and then cluster 1 students. Okay, so we will, so what I did on the next step is like, I just did a one-way ANOVA just to compare the pretest scores of the 3 clusters, and the model was completely insignificant. There was no significant difference between the pretest scores of the 3 clusters. Similarly, I just did a post-test one-way ANOVA for these clusters, and you can see from the box plot itself that the model was significant. And there, it means like there was a significant difference among the clusters. In order to dive in a little bit more into the data, I used a post hoc test, which is known as Tukey HSD test, to just do a pairwise comparison. So you can see students in cluster 1 demonstrated a significantly higher level of intercultural growth than C2 students. Similarly, student in C1, the C1 is basically cluster 1. Cluster 1 demonstrated a significantly higher level of intercultural gains than C3 students. And when we compared C2 and C3 students, we saw that students in C2 demonstrated a significantly higher intercultural learning gain than C3 students. Okay, so now we move on to the qualitative analysis, which is the phase 3 of the results, and I will show you the results cluster-wise. So as we have noted from the quantitative results that students in the cluster 1, they started in minimization, I would say cusp of minimization and polarization, and they reached to acceptance. Similar things were noted in their reflection as well. So when we did the thematic analysis for the cluster 1 students, we saw that students developed an understanding of intercultural communication, as well as they showed empathy towards other culture. So for example, you can see student 1, he mentions that he can interact with students from various, he can interact with people from various culture, and he acknowledges that it is a difficult thing to do. He also talks about the instances of miscommunication. He says that when there is a miscommunication, he has learned how to manage his emotions, and he knows that how to continue the communication calmly. On the similar lines, we see student 2, she has mentioned that she believes that she has learned, like through the study abroad program, she has learned to respond to ambiguous situations. For example, she says that she's living in a different country which speaks a different language than hers, and she has learned to ask more questions if she doesn't understand a situation, and also she doesn't get frustrated due to the lack of understanding of that particular situation. So in both the instances, we see that students are demonstrating features like they are suspending the judgment while they are talking about the other culture. They are also demonstrating tolerance towards ambiguity, which is like they don't get frustrated when they don't understand things. Rather, they are showing empathy, or they are showing an attitude to adapt in that particular situation. They are showing a positive attitude towards other culture. And we also see that there are instances of understanding of verbal and non-verbal communication when interacting with the population different from them. Okay, so for the cluster 2 and cluster 3 student, we saw one single theme that emerged, which is like we saw that students in both these clusters demonstrated a willingness to understand and adapt when interacting with people from other cultures. For example, C2 student, he mentioned that as a future engineer, he needs to be more adaptable to other culture, which means like he should learn to articulate his thoughts well, and should not assume that the person from other culture will understand what he is saying. So that is basically demonstrate like he acknowledged the importance of being adaptable, especially if he's going to be an engineer in future. On the similar line, C3, like basically the cluster 3 student, she mentioned that she has learned to put in efforts to understand people from different background, because that has opened doors for better friendship and easier communication. So in both the instances, we see that students are demonstrating mindfulness in order to understand other culture, and also openness, like they are open to change themselves and their perspectives when interacting with someone different. One common theme that emerged for all these students, because they were all engineering students, and one common theme that I saw across all these 3 clusters was that all the 3 cluster of students mentioned that developing intercultural competence is important for engineering. And we have very interesting sub-themes. For the cluster 1, we see that this particular group basically said that the knowledge of intercultural competence will help them to understand others and create efficient products. This was really an interesting thought, because these students were focused on how, as an engineer, they can create inclusive products, how, as an engineer, they can create safe products. For example, this particular student, she mentioned that intercultural skills are really important for engineering, or as engineer, it is very important because people come from various backgrounds and their upbringing is very different, right? Every culture has a different upbringing. So in engineering, the objective is to come up with the safest, most efficient solution. And this can only happen if you basically consider the multitude of solutions or perspectives. So in that case, we see how the students has integrated both the ideas, that she is able to link the intercultural competence as well as how it is important for engineering, where we need multiple perspectives in order to build an inclusive design. For the cluster 2 students, they link the intercultural competence with securing an engineering job. So in this case, like, students were more focused on how intercultural competence can make them an ideal candidate for the job. For example, this particular student, he mentioned that he wants to join aviation industry in future, and he says that having this particular skill will be making him a valued candidate. The reason is, like, employers will see a strong passion, curiosity, and the desire in him to learn about other cultures. The cluster 3 students, they also mentioned that intercultural skills are really crucial for them because it will help them to develop good work relationships. And she says in a workplace, especially in engineering, where people are coming from different backgrounds, having intercultural skill will translate to making good communication with the co-workers and also help to get the work done faster. Okay, so we can conclude from this study, based on the quantitative findings, we can conclude that cluster 1 and cluster 2 students demonstrated a meaningful growth in the intercultural learning, which was basically growth of more than 7 points. Cluster 3 students did demonstrate a decrease, but it was not a meaningful regression because it was negative 4.84 and less than negative 7. An important thing to note here is that students in cluster 1 demonstrated a deeper understanding of intercultural values than cluster 2 and cluster 3 students. All these 3 students acknowledge the importance of intercultural learning in engineering. The most important thing that we saw in this particular study is that the impact of intentionally designed study abroad program, because just as Kristen had also mentioned in her talk, that just allowing the students to do a study abroad cannot make them interculturally competent. And that is very true, because you need to focus on, like, what are the initiatives or what are the strategies that you are taking in order to help those students to change their mindset. So I think intentionally designed study abroad program was one of the key things that basically brought change into the intercultural mindset of these students, and we saw intercultural gains. Finally, mentoring and engaging students in guided reflections is really important because that helped them to focus on their prior knowledge and understand the current experience from that perspective. So I think that is really important because you have a guide who can help you to understand what you are actually seeing. Finally, we have some implications for teaching and learning. The first one is that instructors must focus on creating a curriculum which has an experiential component attached to it. It's very important that even though if students are not going study abroad, that's completely fine. But the thing is that the curriculum should allow students to experience something which can help them to understand the differences in the culture, acknowledge those differences, and learn from them. Engaging students in guided reflection is crucial because that helps them to critically think through the process, articulate their thoughts, and also reflect on their prior experience. Finally, curriculum integration with constant mentoring can help students to understand intercultural competence and also internalize these concepts. Lastly, this study definitely has some limitations. The first limitation is that this study used the data only for engineering students enrolled in the 2022 SAIL program. The reason was we were focused on understanding the learnings or intercultural gains from the engineering standpoint. The second limitation is that this study did not use a control group for engineering students to compare the results. In order to overcome these limitations, we plan to do a comparative study in future where we see the gains of engineering versus non-engineering students. We also plan to assess the impact of the intervention using a control group. And lastly, we plan to conduct in-depth interviews to learn more about student experiences, because in this case, we just focused on student reflection. So these are my references. That's all from my side. Thank you so much. And I am ready for any questions.
Thank you, Aparajita. Thank you, Kirsten. This was really exciting, and I am looking forward to your questions. So the floor is open. You can just unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can raise a hand, or otherwise just you can also type your question in the chat.
Yes, I have one question, and my question is, which were notable features characterizing the three clusters? Notable features, I mean, let me say, specific characteristics of the course that the students attended, or any specific characteristic or of the students themselves in terms of previous experience about intercultural topics or issues.
Yeah, I think
Thank
that's
you.
how, yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. And that's a great question. I think the characteristic that basically was like all these students, they were enrolled in the same program, which was the SAIL program. And the characteristic, another thing that went as an input for this particular algorithm was the pre and the post IDI score, which was taken by all the students at the same time point. So they became the two important characteristics that made the group look the same, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question. Hearing you out, I mean, obviously an international student, right? And you use the framework of calls. And you said that, if I recall correctly, you said that you cannot understand something if you haven't received an experience of it, more or less.
No. Oh, okay. So I said that you understand something better if you have an experience of that.
Okay, because I was thinking on then how, as educators, how we are going to develop something to help our students to get more in depth what an intercultural competency is or another experience, right? So I wanted just, because the way I understood is like you need to experience it in order to learn it. So, okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So we have a question for Kirsten in the chat, and it's from Siking. And the question is, what lessons, Kirsten, you learned could be transferred into virtual research collaboration for non-international scenarios?
Yeah, so I think so in general, just research collaborations that are virtual. So I think anything where you can spend time getting to know your collaborators, I think that was one of the key things was in the cases where it was international, they wanted to focus on starting to understand the cultural piece. But even if there isn't a cultural difference going on, you could still focus on getting to know your collaborators, because understanding more about who they are and what their interests are and where they come from and how they do research will help improve the research project in general.
And maybe, Kirsten, if I may add, maybe another piece of that would be to understand maybe culture, not necessarily as just in terms of national culture, right? But the other aspects of cultural difference that can come into play, like gender or, you know, ethnicity, maybe linguistics, some differences. So maybe that could also be like a valuable takeaway.
Yeah,
Right.
Yes, I have one question for Kirsten too. Basically, my observation, I acted as mentor for SAIL over several semesters. So the impression I got is that the young guys basically do not have yet the ability to perceive differences. So sometimes I wonder if it might be, if we might stimulate them, particularly in virtual, courses without going effectively abroad. If we could stimulate them by putting them in a completely different, strange, absolutely unbelievable context, where they have to uproot completely, okay, what they think. I'm thinking, for example, I don't know, situation solving some kind of engineering problem in a context such as a desert in India, in Africa, and asking them, well, how you can solve this problem there with those kind of resources. Okay, this is basically just the idea, how to stimulate them, okay, to think about, to reflect about themselves and about differences. Because my impression is that attending, for example, some kind of engineering course in a Spanish university, even though there are differences in culture between US and Spain, but at the end, commonalities, and particularly the necessity of, or let me say, the urgency of obtaining the result prevail about the time the students can spend about observing differences.
Yeah, there's some interesting research on different types of activities you can do to try to get students out of their comfort zone in a classroom. So there's like cultural simulations and things like that. I haven't seen it specifically, for engineers, but that would be an interesting thing to think about, how to integrate maybe a cultural simulation of some sort with an engineering problem at the same time. I know it looks like Gabrielle logged off, but he teaches a class where he's got case studies where he integrates different cultural contexts with engineering problems. And so maybe trying to bring more of the experience of those contexts instead of just reading about it could help students think more about that. Kind of, you were saying, getting them out completely differently out of their normal way of being somehow in a classroom that's an interesting question. How can we help them do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a question that I asked myself, to which extent this might provide a kind of, let me say, guided jolt to the students.
Yeah, that's kind of one of my thoughts with doing the video reflections that I'm doing. Like, I want to identify specific incidents that are particularly jolting.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I want to figure out, like, okay, if I know that this was really jolting for a student who was abroad, could I use that example somehow in a classroom? Could I build a case study? Could I do a role play? Could I make a video?
Exactly.
Like, is there something I could take that thing that I know was transformative for one student and try to put it into like a classroom context in some creative way? So that's kind of where I'm going with that project too, is trying to think about what specific experiences we could do that with. Yeah.
The incident may happen or may not happen. And my idea was that, okay, beyond that, giving the student since the beginning, or at least a kind of virtual environment where they are in a situation completely different, and they cannot avoid to think and reflect about it.
Yeah.
Kirsten, there's another question, or for both of you, for Kirsten and Aparajita. So Michael is asking if there was any particular measures taken in either case study to note gender differences, because the vast majority of US study abroad students identify as female, and engineering students are typically male.
Yeah, it's always a problem with, or not a problem, but like when you're trying to write about global programs and you're trying to say this population is representative, it's never representative of engineering in general. Yeah, in our analysis, I'm trying to remember if there were any noted gender differences. We did look at it, and I think we concluded that that wasn't, we looked at a number of variables, especially when we were doing the global virtual team projects, and we were looking at which variables might influence students, like increasing IDI scores. And the one that was the most significant was the ones who'd had the intercultural training. And so, it wasn't like there was differences between US students and students who are in Ecuador, or gender, or other, variables that we had. Like, I think we had different disciplines too, but the one that was the most significant was whether or not they'd had the intercultural training previously.
So, Michael, just to answer your question, I did not look at the gender differences because, I did not get the demographic data for that particular data set. But yeah, it's a good point. I'll definitely look into it and I'll get back to you with an answer.
There was another interesting question about previously in the chat from Rhonda. So she was actually asking Kirsten if we could have a sample of what those journal and video questions prompts looked like. And I think I have a similar question for Aparajita, maybe like, so you said that reflections, right, written reflections were the basis for the qualitative data analysis. So what can we do maybe to engage students in doing those reflections? Like, what kind of prep do they receive to know how to write a guided reflection, right? So do they receive any training in how to do that, how to write in a reflective way, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Tatiana. I think the roles of the mentors come into play in this particular case because they basically guide the students on how to, because they are basically engaging students for those 90 minutes, helping them to reflect through the activities. And imagine that you are discussing with someone for 90 minutes about your experiences or learning from your peers about their experiences. It will definitely give you some idea about how to articulate your experiences better. And the second opportunity is like the program is structured in such a way, and they are given, like, the scaffolding is done in such a way that they are given beautiful prompts to think through the process. And I think that is one of the key things that they take into consideration, and they write those reflections better. Also, these mentors, they provide feedback on every assignment. So, and since I analyzed the last one, so you can see the difference, right? So basically, as you progress and you are doing a semester-long study abroad, and at the end of, let's say 6 months, you will definitely, after getting a constant feedback from the mentor, you will be in a position to articulate your thoughts well, because you are receiving a constant mentoring from someone experienced.
Yeah, so the question about what were the prompts? So I use when I was comparing the interviews, the journals, and the videos, I was using a critical incident question. So a critical incident question is essentially asking, tell me a story about a time when something happened. And so you can insert whatever type of incident you're looking for. And so what I asked them for was a time when a significant learning experience that you had when you learned something about culture. And in all of them, that was what they were responding to. And so I found when I'm asking students to talk about study abroad, it's easier, instead of asking them, what did you learn? Because if you ask them, or how was your experience, or what was your study abroad experience like open-ended questions like that are really hard to answer. But when you say, tell me about a specific experience that you had, or something that was an exciting moment for you, then they tell a story, and it's much easier to then tell how are they thinking about their experience and what are they learning from it. That kind of comes out as part of the story, or you can have follow-up questions to dig into it in more detail. But that's the kind of question that I was using. And in terms of how do we help students reflect? So I actually have like a short, 20-minute talk that I do about what is reflection for engineering students. And I talk about both, what do I mean, but what do we mean by reflection? And I have a little, essentially, I tell them you need to ask yourself questions, you need to respond to them. And we do a little example where they come up with questions to reflect about a certain type of experience. And then I connect it to engineering and talk about how engineers need to reflect on their design process, right? You try to design something and something doesn't work. So you have to reflect on, okay, what were the assumptions we were making? What was the inputs we were using? What types of things do we need to improve for the next iteration? Which is kind of like, right, the Kolb cycle. It's very similar to the engineering design process in some ways. So I make that connection for them too.
Thank you. There's another question for Aparajita, technical question. Is there a consensus in the intercultural community on the meaningful difference on the IDI score?
Yes.
As typically scholars would refer to effect size as the common way to examine if the statistical difference to be practically meaningful.
Right. That's a wonderful question. So meaningful gains are basically, there are literature which talks about the meaningful gain. I can share one in the chat. So basically, here the statistical, more than statistical gain, it's more about how meaningfully you are gaining. And it is basically one of the papers by, I think this has been already defined in the paper by Hammer. And there is another paper, which is a very recent paper from 2019, which is by Jones et al. And I can share that particular paper, which talks about the meaningful gain on the IDI scores. And by meaningful, they mean like if you are gaining more than 7 points on IDI, you are actually making a real world difference in your intercultural competence. You could be statistically significant if you just make a difference of 4 points, right? Because statistics is very different from a real, like getting a statistical significance. You can even get it if you make a difference of 4 points, but you can only make a meaningful increase or a real world intercultural gain if you are gaining more than 7 points on IDC. So yes, I will share the paper with you, and yeah, and I think that would be helpful for you if you want to cite something related to meaningful gains in terms of IDI.
I have another question for Kirsten. So you noticed that having prior intercultural learning is the difference maker sort of in the gains, right? Post the experience, be it study abroad experience maybe, or on campus kind of experience. So my question is, so what can be done, or what are you maybe concretely doing to make that intercultural learning happen before these experiences in global teams or in study abroad, for example?
Yeah, so in the global teams class, what we did is the next semester, we started building in some more intercultural training early in the semester. I mean, we had done we didn't do 0 the first time, but it was more limited. And so we decided, okay, we need to build in more of it. So there's now several weeks where they do different intercultural activities in the class and talk about, do some, like sit in their team or like be in their teams virtually and discuss different things and work through different parts of the project that way. So we did try to build it into the class a little bit more intentionally. And also we built it into the final project a little bit more intentionally, where they had to, in addition to presenting their technical solution, they had to present a little bit about their team, who they were, how they learned about each other and how they work together and that sort of thing. So we added more of that also to the final deliverable to help them have a little bit more motivation to keep thinking about that at the end of the semester as well. And then in study abroad programs that I've run before, we've had, different, you might take, somebody mentioned like a 1 credit class you might take before. I think that was what you said, the SAIL students maybe do, or just a couple, pre-travel meetings or things like that. We've done before as well.
Thank you. One more thing, if I interpreted correctly, what you said is that maybe, in the video form, while you get maybe thicker data in terms of like better detailed, better description of a richer description of daily incidents. If I saw that right, I thought that reflection maybe wasn't there as much as in the written form. Was that correct? Or like the depth of reflection, maybe?
I don't think so. No, it's actually the journals have less, at least in the data I was looking at. It's the interviews and the video reflections where students are talking. I found that they tend to go into a lot more detail about what they're thinking, whereas when they're writing, at least engineering students maybe feel less comfortable writing, they won't put as much detail in there.
There was interesting, yeah, because I thought that the reflection piece was like a little bit maybe less in the oral form as opposed to the written. I was just found that
other way around.
Okay, yeah. All right, okay.
Tatiana, I have just put the link of the paper in the chat, and a typo happened in the meanwhile. Instead, it should be meaningful gains, and instead it's meaning fun gains.
Yeah,
So
there's
meaningful
and
gains.
probably fun as well. Yes. Okay, so thank you for that. So you dropped the paper, and also I sort of inserted all the links to IKC value rubric, the IDC, and the Bloom's taxonomy of what was being mentioned in the papers,
Okay.
in the presentation. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions, or maybe some experiences to share, or some comments or suggestions? So maybe one question would be just to, in terms of the future, what do you anticipate? What is the direction in which you will maybe take your research in the future for both of you?
Kristen, you want to go first?
Sure. So all of the projects that I talked about are still ongoing. For the one that is the thing that I'm focusing on the most is kind of that video reflection question, because I'm trying to explore that data collection method and see what types of research questions it can help answer for study abroad, but also other contexts. When other types of experiences is it helpful to kind of get a more day-to-day perspective on what students are experiencing, compared to interviews or something at the end. So I'm continuing to explore that, and then think about, like I was saying earlier in response to a different question, how can I take the incidents that are reported in those videos and then, imagine ways to create learning modules that you could do in a classroom and try to integrate those types of experiences into a classroom in different ways, and how can they be connected to engineering?
So in my case, I would look forward to learning more in this particular field, because I have really just started, I would say. So yeah, I am open to looking into engineering as well as into the non-engineering field. And I'm also looking into a few of the non-traditional fields as well when it comes to study abroad initiatives. And also, I don't want to just keep myself restricted to study abroad, rather go into the see how the curriculum interventions can help students to develop intercultural competence, like as Kristen mentioned, without studying abroad, because at times studying abroad is very costly and it's not affordable by all the students. So basically looking into the impact of the curricular, structured curriculum interventions, doing some longitudinal studies with that, and seeing that how students are growing, let's say from the first year of their college to the fourth year, just through curriculum integration and constant mentoring inside the institution.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or suggestions or a comment? No. Okay, so if we think we exhausted, yes, the questions, I want to thank both of you for these wonderful presentations and for the learning that happened here today. And I just wanted to announce what's going on next with the Pickle Cup. I will send you this this PowerPoint that has the links that have been mentioned in the presentations, and also some other some other resources that you can access through Sylmar's Hubble that might be of interest. And this is the contact information also for the presenters. And I would like to announce what's going on next. So we have partnered with Purdue XED Experiential Education, and they are offering a Champions Workshop on February 15th from 3 to 4:30. So this is an in-person event. And Joe Tort and Michael Bittinger will talk about teaching intercultural learning skills. So if you are on campus, this is a great opportunity to continue the learning. And if you are not at Purdue, so if you're looking for the next next virtual opportunity, then we will have one in April, April 4th, and it will be about enhancing study abroad. So these will be the reflection on social justice and intercultural learning assessment. We will have 2 presenters again. And I believe we do have a little bit more of time. So if you would be willing to provide a little bit of a feedback via a poll, just to see what you thought about today's experience, we would be very grateful, because we'd like to assess, what we do in Pickle Cup, and your input is really valued. So I will click polls. It is only 4 questions. It is really easy, and I hope it works. Okay, I haven't done this in a while, so it is an anonymous poll with just 4 questions. Thank you to everyone for participating, for learning together. It was a real pleasure, and I hope to see you soon, either in person on February 15th or maybe virtually. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.